Hello everyone, so today we're going to be looking at adaptations, and the study design dot point that you need to know is the structural, physiological and behavioral adaptations that enhance an organism's survival and enable life to exist in a wide range of environments. The type of environments we're going to be looking at are hot environments and cold environments, and we're going to look at the structural, physiological and behavioral adaptations for plants and animals. So let's get started. Firstly, what is an adaptation? Well, it is a feature of an organism that makes it suited to its environment and therefore better able to survive in that environment. There are three types of adaptations that you need to know and be able to identify in different organisms. So you need to be able to identify structural adaptations, so that's the physical features of an organism, whether that be an animal or a plant. The physiological adaptation, so any sort of biological function, again in an animal or a plant, and behavioral adaptation, so those are the actions of animals. Right, so plants don't have behaviors, it's just animals that will have behavioral adaptations. It's important to note that organisms with beneficial adaptations are more likely to survive long enough to reproduce and then pass on their DNA. So organisms that are suited to the environment will live and reproduce. They'll have offspring that they pass their beneficial adaptations onto through those alleles that are beneficial or suited to that environment. And therefore, the next generation is also suited to the environment, and you are enabling the survival of the species as a whole. So the adaptations not only allow the individual organism to survive, it allows the survival of the species as a whole. And this links into how species evolve over time, which is a year 12 topic, but this links in pretty closely with it. Also need to know that organisms without these beneficial adaptations therefore are less likely to survive, and they won't pass on their DNA, and so organisms not suited to environment more likely to die, and therefore we see less of those adaptations in the next generation and so on. Organisms have a range of tolerance for both abiotic and biotic factors. So biotic means living factors and abiotic is non-living factors. So abiotic can be things like temperature, water, wind, that kind of thing. So for example, we have the fish here who have an optimal range in this temperature. So right here down the middle, this is the ideal temperature for them. Around this range, or in the optimum range, this is where organisms will thrive. Outside that range, a little bit outside their range, they might have some sort of physiological stress, so meaning their biological functioning might not be perfect, but they can survive in that. But very far outside of their range of tolerance, organisms are not able to survive. This is the same for plants. So for example, with pH, in this ideal or optimal range, the plant will thrive. So for this case, it's grass. Outside of this pH range, it will still survive. It won't be doing the best physiologically, but it can still survive. But very far outside that optimal range, it will die. So let's have a look at some adaptations for hot environments. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of different animals and their adaptations. There is no need to memorize these specific animals and these specific adaptations, because in a SAC or an exam, you might be given an organism and you have to figure out what possible adaptations that they could have. So as long as the examples of adaptations that you are giving in a SAC or exam are reasonable and they relate to that organism's environment and that organism's structure or features, then that is okay. So again, don't need to memorize these specific examples, just use them as a framework for how you can identify different adaptations in different organisms. So let's start with this little guy. It's the fennec fox, which is a very small organism and lives in desert environments. So just from looking at this animal, you can kind of see what might help it survive in this very hot environment. So some structural adaptations would be a high surface area to volume ratio of these ears, right? those ears are very large and very thin, so high surface area compared to the volume. This allows the heat from this animal to be released really easy out into the environment. So the heat from here going out. It's also very light colored, and if something is light colored, it is going to reflect heat. So, which obviously is beneficial, so less heat is absorbed in this very hot environment, keeping this animal at a stable internal temperature. So this is all about maintaining homeostasis and about thermoregulation again. So you can link your examples back to thermoregulation. Now some physiological adaptations. So we did structural, so those are physical features. Physiological features are to do with biological functioning. So we've got vasodilation. So this is when the blood vessels increase in size, they're dilating. And as they increase in size, this allows for more heat from the body to be released into the environment. So these two things, so high surface area and volume ratio and vasodilation, they can work together. Because through this animal's ears, there's probably a lot of blood vessels, and as they dilate, the heat can be released from the blood into the environment, therefore cooling down the animal. And lastly, we've got behavioral adaptation. So this animal is nocturnal. It's obviously cooler at night, so it is more beneficial for this animal to be awake at night. Another adaptation might be that it seeks shade. And so seeking shade means it evades the heat, therefore reducing the amount of heat that it absorbs. It can also lick its arms, so this helps with evaporative cooling. So as the animal licks its arms, for example, the saliva that it's on its arms will have the heat drawn into it, and therefore reducing the amount of heat or removing the heat from the animal. So when you're thinking about these adaptations and coming up with examples, they need to be reasonable for the animal. So, for example, if you said that one of the behavioral adaptations is this animal goes for a swim in a lake, that wouldn't be a reasonable adaptation because we know it lives in a desert. It's very unlikely that there's a lake around. So as long as the examples that you are giving are reasonable and relate to this environment as well as the features of the organism, that is okay. Because you may not know exactly what this organism does or may not know a lot about this organism, but you can make these reasonable, educated assumptions. Let's now look at a plant example. So we have a eucalyptus tree right here. A structural adaptation is that it's light colored. You can see the bark, it is very white. Again, if it's light colored, it's going to reflect the heat. That is an adaptation for a hot environment because you don't want the plant isn't absorbing as much heat. Also has a high surface area to volume ratio. For example, the leaves might have a high surface area to volume ratio. They might be very wide and thin, therefore more heat can be released into the environment. Again, reducing the amount of heat that's in the plant. Might have vertical leaves, for example, and eucalyptus leaves do, so the leaves hang vertically downwards, and this reduces the exposure to sunlight, therefore reducing the amount of heat that it absorbs. A physiological adaptation, again, physiological adaptations relate to biological functioning. So if we remember, in leaves there are stomata, so they're the pores in the surface of the leaf that exchange gases and water vapor. So when it is hot, this tree is obviously not going to want to release as much water into the environment. It will need to conserve that water. And the way that it does that is by closing the stomata. If it closes that stomata, it's closing that opening for the water vapor to leave, and therefore it's conserving water, which is very beneficial in a hot environment where it's probably very dry as well and there's not a lot of water available. So by closing the stomata, it's adapted to that hot environment to conserve water and therefore survive longer in this hot environment. Let's have a look at some adaptations for cold environments now. So here we have an emperor penguin, obviously lives in the snow, as you can see. Just from looking at this penguin, even if you don't know very much about it, there are some assumptions you can make about the adaptations it would have to enable it to survive in this very cold environment, such as the structural adaptation. So it has a lot of insulation, meaning that it can trap warm air underneath those layers, underneath the layers, or there is a very large layer of fat that is able to trap the heat in its body. It has a low surface area to volume ratio, right? It is very round, obviously has a lot of fat, and therefore, because there is a lot of volume compared to the surface area, it takes a lot longer for heat to be released from inside the penguin out. Right? So this is beneficial. The penguin needs to retain that heat. It also has oily skin, which helps repel water. Obviously beneficial if you are living in a very cold environment to repel that water, therefore heat isn't being taken away from the body. Now we have some physiological adaptations. So they are endotherms, meaning they maintain their body temperature through generating heat internally. So humans are also endotherms. We regulate our body heat internally. We do not rely on the environment to regulate our internal heat. And that is a physiological adaptation for living in a cold environment. Because if, for example, we had a lizard that relies on the sun to heat it up, it would not survive in this cold environment because it is not adapted to this cold environment. We also have vasoconstriction, so this is when the blood vessels become thinner and smaller. Again, this has the opposite effect of what we saw in the hot environment, in that it minimizes the amount of heat lost to the environment. And lastly, we have behavioral adaptation. So if you've ever seen penguins do this, they huddle around in a group like this, and they're exchanging heat between individuals, so they're sharing that heat. So you might have experienced this on a really cold day. When you're out with your friends, you might stand really close together because it's a lot warmer to stand really close together and share each other's body heat. Another behavioral adaptation might be finding shelter from the cold temperatures or wind. So this might be under rocks or in some sort of cave, that kind of thing. I'm going to finish with an example of a plant that is adapted to a cold environment. So here we have this reindeer moss that you can see all along the ground. And so structurally, the adaptations here is that it's small in size and close to the ground. Therefore, less energy is required to sustain the whole plant. So these are some sort of adaptations that you can think about if you're looking at plants in cold environments. These might not be things that you've really thought about, but I'm giving you some examples that you may be able to apply to other plants that live in cold environments. They also have hairs on their leaf, on the leaves, and those hairs act as insulation. So if you have a leaf here and you have hairs sticking up on the leaf, you get underneath those hairs, you get a layer of warm air trapped. And so these hairs are stopping that, I guess, that warm air from leaving. In the same way that when you are cold, the hair on your arms may stand up, and that traps that warm air close to your skin to keep you a little bit warmer. That's the same, I guess, action that the hairs on the leaves have. And lastly, the plants grow close together. So if they're growing close together, there is more protection from the wind and the snow. Alrighty, and to finish off, I just want you to remember that these adaptations provide animals or plants with an advantage in the hot or cold environments. They help an animal or plant survive by regulating water loss and heat loss. So whether that be increasing heat loss in a hot environment or decreasing heat loss in a cold environment. Or in a hot environment, you are decreasing water loss. So both of these can be applied to hot and cold environments. It's important really to know that surviving long enough means being able to reproduce and then pass on DNA. And this enables the survival of the individual, but also the survival of the species. So that species is adapted to the environment that it lives in. So today we have gone over adaptations to hot and cold environments. Of course, there are other adaptations that you might be able to think of. For example, how, I guess, camouflage works and how that's an adaptation against predators, or how animals in aquatic environments have adaptations that benefit maybe swimming, for example. So there are many different types of adaptations that you can think of. The ones that we want you to know and understand are the adaptations for hot and cold environments. And as usual, I'm going to leave you with this meme. I hope you've learnt a little bit today. Please write down your questions and I will see you in class.